Alrighty, welcome back. Now we're just going to make some quick changes to the items on the agenda. We're going to move now to 9.11, which is an annual report to Alcohol Regulatory Authority, and then I'll tell you after that, but I'll now pass over to Councillor Shannon because I've declared a conflict. Thanks, Councillor Shannon.
Thank you, Your Worship. So moving to 9.11, invite Mr. Cooper, Group Manager Environmental Services, forward. And
thank you
very much.
It's Sharon Hugenrad, who's Acting Environmental Compliance Manager. This report is our largely an administrative one that we submit every year to the regulatory, to ALA, as it's known, and it basically outlines the licensing activity of the DLC during the year prior, the number of licenses and renewals and managers' certificates that we've processed during the year. But I'll hand over to Sharon, who is very much our subject matter expert.
Okay, so the report is a public record for the purposes of the Act, and it has to be available for inspection on the Council's website for a period of not less than 5 years. Section 199 of the Act requires that within 3 months of the end of the financial year, we must prepare and send to ALA a report. So this is attached to this report, and I'm more than happy to answer any in Debbie's absence.
Thank you very much, Sharon. Before I hand over and ask the other councillors, I only had one question in terms of premises that were visited out of a total of 139, representing 30%.
Yes.
Is there a standard or a benchmark you try to work to there?
There isn't a benchmark as such, but for the last year I've basically been on my own. So we have employed it's a half licensing inspector. So we now have 2 full-time licensing inspectors. However, we are still down 1 administration officer at the moment. So we are hoping to be out there monitoring on a more regular basis now that we have the resources.
So if you've got a target as such, you'd love to be able to visit?
I would love to be able to visit 80%.
Thank you. Councillors, any questions?
I have a question, and I don't know, you might be able to answer or not. I see Ballantyne's has a on licence and off licence.
Yes.
So I'm just assuming that they probably use that for functions. So for other retailers that would like to provide a glass of alcohol at a function, is it an easier process just to get an on licence rather than try to apply for one when they need it?
Okay, so Ballantyne's have an on licence because they have a cafe. So it's the cafe that's actually licensed. So when it comes to the likes of, there's a fashion show that's held on a regular basis at one of our fashion shops, they get a special licence for that because it's a one-off event, a special event, whereas Ballantyne's is a restaurant cafe.
Thank you, Councillor Parker. Any other questions? Councillor Scott.
Thank you. Page 121, it just talks about costs for TDC activities, which was a total of 174,000, and it was like for elected members, allowances, travel costs. What is the majority of that though? Is that for hearings, and is that across all the district? Oh no, that's just Timaru District Council, isn't it? So what's the bulk of the 174? Like, what is the allowance just to be part of this group?
Staff resourcing?
It'll be
what
staff resourcing for hearings, the Commissioner's costs, travel allowance or mileage that we pay her for travel, and I think all of the above for the operation of the DLC. So it will probably include staff RAM as well.
Oh, so it's for staff, not for elected members, as it says there. It says it's made up of elected members' allowances. It doesn't talk about staff.
Administration costs.
That's okay. I just thought, oh.
Well, I'll have to come back to you because the author's not there at the moment.
Oh, sorry.
But I'm assuming that in the last 12 months, for example, we might have had a hearing.
No.
We haven't?
No.
I haven't got that detail
I'm
to
just
hand,
being
sorry,
like, I'm
Karen.
just wondering how,
Yeah.
yeah, sorry.
So we have a district licensing committee meeting once a week, and the commissioner comes up once a week for that. So you'll have her time plus her travel time, and all of those things will be added together. Plus she does training sometimes, plus I believe there may be the joint.
Oh, so it isn't our, oh, yeah, okay, so it's all of those people's allowances. Okay.
And in terms of any extra time that goes on there, if I was going to review as a standing member on there, I can put an application in for a standard allowance that's there, and I haven't done so for many, many years, actually. I think the last time was I replaced the commissioner for a period of time, and that was some time ago.
Oh, no, that's right. And my other question was, we're looking for an additional resource, hopefully an increase of 0.5. Does that get spread across the 3 districts, or is that oh, yeah, nice. Okay, thanks.
Thank you. No, any further questions? No, that being the case, would somebody like to move the recommendation? Thank you, Councillor Oliver, seconded. Thank you, Councillor Jackson. All those in favour, please say aye. Against? Carried. Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr Cooper. Thank you, Sharon. Much appreciated. Back to you, Your Worship.
Thank you, Deputy Mayor. Actually, Mr Cooper, if you stay, and I'll invite Joe up now, and we're going to just do the dog control annual report, which is 9.10. Yeah, and sorry, and Sharon, in your acting role.
Thank you, Your Worship. This is our annual dog control report to the DIA. If you can just take the percentages in the covering report as broadly for guidance rather than accurate, that would be great. But the figures and the hard data in the back is accurate, and that is what the DIA are interested in. The covering report that Sharon and Joe could speak to is about providing a narrative to some of the more interesting changes in those data sets. So I'll hand over. Thanks.
Right. So, once again, Section 10A of the Dog Control Act requires that we provide specific information by way of an annual report, and that is what this is. So we are here to answer any questions you may have in the absence of the author.
Yes, Councillor Pye.
So those increases are quite substantial. So what does the resource for that team look like? Have you got more resources? Are you looking to request more resources, or are you just all burnt out?
All of the above. The team have been running lean for a couple of years, probably, for a district of our size, with the number of dogs that we have, which is we're usually hovering around around 9,000 mark, I think. But and we did carry out, I won't say the R word, a bit of a change proposal during the last 12 months, where we have acquired another animal control officer. So we've now got 3 full-time animal control officers, the 2 after-hours animal control officers, and Joe has stepped into a leadership role across animal control and parking. So that was the change that was required to meet the workload, really. Yeah.
Councillor Jackson.
Just on the number of registered dogs, I mean, everything's up. Infringement notices are up, barking dog complaints are up, dog attacks, rushes are up. So it's a bit of a trend, isn't it, of behaviour of dogs. How does that compare to, do we know, other places around the country? I mean, how are we tracking with that?
Oh, there we go. Right, cool. So, yeah, I don't formally know the answer to that, but I do know from discussions with colleagues and that dog attacks in particular are up across the board. Yeah, but I couldn't give you a formal statistical answer, yeah.
So the amount of dogs that are not registered, that's on the rise, it's on the increase here. So what ways have we been trying to mitigate that? I think we've done is it the discount for early registration?
Yes, I'll let Jo speak to that. She's all over that stuff.
To work. So I do believe that like the cost of living is to answer for a lot of people not being able to afford dog registration as they typically would in previous years. We try and mitigate that by so this year we have sent out text reminders to try and remind people to get on board so that they can pay within between July and August so that they don't incur those late payment penalties and things like that. So reminding them, hey, get in now before, you have to end up paying more and that sort of thing. So we are trying to work on that, yeah.
Has that been successful in your opinion? Has that worked?
Yes, it has been in this registration year, so from July 1st, which will show hopefully next year that we've had more successful outcome in that area, yeah.
I think it's fair to say, Councillor Jackson, there has been a noticeable increase in people registering their dogs late or not registering at all. There's been also an increase in the time taken to recover the costs or the fees from people. So even when we fine people, the people paying their fines is decreased as well. So like collecting the money is proving to be more of a challenge than it has been in previous years.
I just noticed that up in the far north of that they did a sponsorship deal with one of the local food, pet food companies, and they offered biscuits for the dogs, for the owners of the dogs. They got 650 more registrations, so that's an idea maybe for the future.
Can you clarify, were the biscuits for the owners or the dogs?
I think there was a packet of Tim Tams for the owners and the rest were for the dogs, mate.
Do you see an opportunity there?
You get bribed by a wee puppuccino and a wee bicky, you think? I would just note that, large amount of dog ownership per capita actually in our district, but you've got to remember that owning a dog and the cost of the dog over a life is actually a luxury. And, people, they can say we can't afford this item. It's an item that maybe they shouldn't have had in the first place. And that's some of the education that we need to do. The cost over life of a dog is phenomenal. It's like owning a child, owning a child. Yeah, I knew you'd catch me. Someone would catch me on that one. You never own a child, do you? There's no return in owning a child, that's for sure. But anyway, Councillor Shannon. Councillor Oliver.
I see the microchipping's gone up quite a bit from 40 to 103. Were we doing free microchipping at one stage or really low cost microchipping? Are we still doing that or have we given that away?
Yes, we were doing that, and then COVID came along and we decided to put a pause on those clinics until all the lockdowns and everything were over, and now we've started them back up. So as of this year, we've started them back up. Yeah.
Fantastic. Thank you. Well, thank you. That's really informative. I appreciate that. And some good helpful comments around the table. I'm happy to move that report now. Can I have a seconder? Thank you, Councillor Jackson. I'll put the motion now. All those in favour, please say aye. Against. Thank you. And thank you for the work in this space. We know it's very challenging and not easy for staff, so we do appreciate the work. Thank you. Sorry, I'm moving us all around at the moment, but I'm just trying to manage staff's time and just so they're not sitting at the back watching the entire meeting. So I'm going to move now to 9.15, which is Timaru District Council Cemetery Bylaw minor amendment. So Bronwyn, and we've got Steph as well. Thank you. And that's on page 341.
Thank you, Worship. Thank you, councillors. We're going to give you a little bit of a narrative because it's a bit more interesting than looking at boring facts and figures. So this is Steph from Parks Policy and the asset analyst who's going to start, and then I'll come back and talk about the really boring, exciting stuff about bylaws and interpretation of legislation.
Okay, so what brought us here to this point is I was approached by the Muslim community. Currently we don't have provision for Muslim burials anywhere in our district. Through these conversations, the community was really happy with the process that happens up in Christchurch City Council. So I took the opportunity to go and meet with Christchurch Cemetery staff to find out what their process was, what they did on the ground, but also both with their administrative process as well. Following that, we had a kind offer from a group called Working Together Group. They are a Muslim Funeral Services Advisory. They travel around the country advising all cemetery owners on correct process for Muslim burials. Prior to them coming down, I identified a site in Temuka Cemetery. We're very lucky that Temuka, we have a lot of ground to expand. There's also a section in the new part of Temuka Cemetery where we could orientate a beam in the correct way that would utilise some space that otherwise wouldn't get utilised for other standard burials. The advisors came down, viewed the site, were really happy with the site. Following that, we had a discussion in-house with other members of the Muslim community where they advised on other practices and processes. We also had FENS and police in attendance as well, who took the opportunity to upskill in their knowledge about how to deal with deceased Muslim people. After that, well, kind of at the same time as that, I realised we had a bylaws issue where Muslim burials currently don't fit with a traditional burial, but they also don't fit with the natural burial because they still do like to have a cemetery beam to ensure correct orientation of the grave. But then they don't have the traditional headstone, they have a plaque, but then they don't have a casket, so they don't fit the standard burial. So yeah, we're floating in the middle, which is a bit difficult, but that's where Bronwyn came in and talked legal talk to the legal people for me.
So the bylaw, by being descriptive, by saying subsequently planting a native bush or forest, became prescriptive, stopping us to allow that to happen. So we sought some legal advice about how do we go around getting rid of a few words out of a bylaw if it became a barrier to us for what we wanted to do. The legal advice agreed with us that section 156(1)(b) gives council the power to change a bylaw and it doesn't require a special consultation process. However, it does refer back to section 82, which talks about council has to be satisfied that it has consulted with the relevant affected parties. So we've given you two options, but I'm just going to split them up a little bit for you. So the first option is we can just keep the status quo and you can wait for a bylaw review, which TDC will be due in 2 to 3 years. We can keep the status quo or wait for the review of the Burial and Cemetery Act 1964, which has kind of been a bit sidelined and in the current political climate, don't know how long it's going to stay there. Council can take a narrow view of the interpretation of the affected parties to say, well, actually, we've met with the people that we believe are affected, i.e. the Muslim community, and therefore you can say we're satisfied that we've met the consultation requirement under section 82. Or the other option is you can say, actually, there may be others who are affected. we might need to go out to do a small consultation and instruct officers to run a small consultation. So over to you. Any questions?
I'd just like to add there that this is really about enabling internments from our increasingly diverse communities. So we are talking about Muslims here, but there may be other ethnic groups as well that may not, really want to plant a tree above their graves, effectively. So this is what it is about. So it's just about enabling, giving a little bit more flexibility within the bylaw.
Thank you. We'll go, yes, Councillor Parker, then I think Councillor Shannon.
Thank you, Mayor. Very supportive of this. Just recalling through our long-term plan last term, myself and Councillor Gilchrist at that stage met with the Muslim community, and cemeteries was raised there. And probably we talked about our new cemetery, how we need to make sure that we are catering for all religions in our community. Who do you think are the other affected parties?
That's open to your interpretation. As Andrew said, for example, I might want to have a natural burial because I'm thinking about the climate, but I might decide I don't want a tree, I'd like a rose bush. By removing the prescriptive nature of what the words are, that can open it up. So it's up to council. It's that lovely significant engagement option about what is significant and what is significance and the difference between the two. The Muslim community are the significant group, but you have to determine whether or not this is a significance issue to the ratepayers.
Yeah,
Sorry, Councillor Parker.
So, the consultation could be just basically a public notice sort of thing, and say, advertising the fact that we're intending to change our bylaw to the wider community and is seeking feedback. It can be simple. It doesn't have to be a formal consultation process in regard to the special consultative procedure. Yeah.
So would we be able to do that in-house with the staffing we have
To
at the
support
moment?
you even more, the background has already been developed and built. It would just require us putting it out on Facebook, TDC website and other social media and in the newspaper. Small consultation window of maybe 2 weeks, and then hopefully be able to bring it back to you by December.
I think you've just about answered my question, actually. Yeah, isn't it remarkable how something, a few words, can end up being so bloody complex? I'm happy to move option 1.
Thank you. Got to move any further in a discussion? Councillor Parker, you happy to second that? Thank you. Appreciate that, and that's a good way forward for that community. Appreciate that. I'll put the motion now. All those in favour, please say aye. Against, carried. Thanks, team.
Could I just check what was the movement?
It was option 1, which is that council endorse the proposed amendments to the bylaws. That's correct, isn't it? Is that correct? Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Fantastic. We're going to go back to 9.7 on page 59, Arangi Stadium Trust. And we had some with conflicts. All right, pick up. And welcome Trudy and Bede, who wants to.
Thank you, Your Worship. So this flows on. We provided a letter of comfort last year, and attached is the one that was provided. But essentially, the trust is a CCO, and the auditors are saying that of its own resources, it's not in a position necessarily to potentially meet all its obligations. Therefore, in order for it to be considered a going concern, would Council please provide a letter of comfort? A letter of comfort is essentially an assurance from Council, who do have the resources, that we will provide it. We will provide any financial support necessary to ensure it's able to meet its obligations. So that's the essence of it, and I can take questions, Your Worship.
Councillor Pye.
I have no issues with the letter of comfort, but I just question why in their report that undertaking of the review has only been partially met, when that review was kind of flagged over a year ago, and I feel like we haven't made any progress there. Well, that was a review on future cost funding and ownership structure. I just wondered if there's an update on what's actually happening with that review.
Yeah, so I think there's a number, and others might be able to comment, but the officer who's most extensively involved is away at the present. But there's a number of factors that play into it, including, I think, wanting to ascertain whether in actual fact any future fundraising for a new stadium is best undertaken via the trust model, and so we need to check that we need to review what is the optimal structure in terms of that, because a trust would have advantages that a council wouldn't in terms of donations and rebatable donations and so on. So it would be that, I think, would be part of it, and it's also a discussion about the future of that stadium as well. So I suspect you've got a number of parts playing into why it is that it's waiting some certainty of direction.
Do you think that review will definitely, well, actually, no, I'll rephrase that. We need to ensure that review is definitely completed before we make any plans for the future of that stadium, in my mind.
I think it is a partnership arrangement, and that would be a discussion that council and the trustees would need to have. I agree with that.
I'd just like to second that, because part of the stadium project, there's a community fundraising element to it. And so, you know, we need to work out what's the trust's purpose in that, because the community may look to another way through, like the Aoraki Foundation, or I don't think there's any hindrance to the council running it though, because we did the pools exactly the same way. But my question around that too is, yes, I think that's very important, and it needs to be done before January, February of next year, so it's quite serious, the review. And if the stadium is demolished because we build a new one, will the trust then cease, or is there vision that that trust will continue on? Like, I don't think there's any purpose for it, but I'm keen to understand what others think of that.
Pardon me, sorry.
What's the point of continuing to write this letter when we're going to build a new stadium and they've got no money?
The auditors are seeking assurance that the trustees, because at the moment there's a facility there that is operating. That's right, yes, but the auditors are, in order to have some assurance that the trust will be able to meet its obligations, are looking for that. What's the purpose? I mean, it does seem to me, I agree, there is a need for that conversation to take place, and what is it? But the trustees are still charged with a fiduciary obligation in respect of that asset, and they need to make sure that that asset, if it's replaced by another asset, I think they're integral to that discussion and what happens to it. Now they're councillors, so they have a dual capacity there, but I think what happens to the trust, it's really the obligation in terms of that facility that is the discussion about, do you want the trust to own an enhanced and updated facility, or do you bring it into council, I guess, is really part of the discussion. I don't know that I can answer that.
No, I think it is for this review, because the point is, if the trust is going to build it, they need to be appropriately set up, GST registered, all of those tax components, and I would suggest they're not right now.
Yeah, look, I think to both Councillor Pye and Councillor Scott, your point, I think maybe number 3 could be an action item for council to meet with the trust pre-Christmas to get a way forward, I think, potentially. But I agree, it does feel like we haven't resolved this for some time. It'd be nice to know where that's at, whether it's this trust or a new trust, that, or whatever the makeup of that ownership model is. So you're comfortable as far as I go forward along those lines? You're happy to move that, Councillor Pye? Yeah, that would be with a 3, would be an action item, just to, yeah, so the trust to meet, yep, no, that covers it. So action to meet with the council pre-Christmas to discuss whether that, let's just say, council to meet with the trust on the future of the trust. That will be fine. I think it covers. Yeah. Okay, so you're happy, mover and seconder with that. Any further discussion? No. So the mover was Councillor Pye and Councillor Scott was seconder. Put the motion now. All those in favour, please say aye. Against, carried. Thank you. 9.8, and we've got proposed district plan hearing panel, and that's page 86. And we'll welcome Hamish and Paul.
I just wanted to note that obviously part of this report is on myself as a councillor, so I'm going to choose to just remove myself from the conversation.
Yep, so a noted conflict because you're going to likely be a panel member. Yep, fantastic. Thanks, Councillor Scott. Look, I'll pass to Mr Cooper to open the report.
Thank you, Your Worship. This report is seeking to formalise the makeup of the District Plan Review Hearings Panel, headed up by King's Counsel Tony Hughes Johnson. He's going to be assisted by some commissioners, planning commissioners. We're talking to two iwi commissioners to assist with that side of things, and we're in the final stages of signing those two up. We're looking also to have a planning advisor to liaise between the council and the panel, and of course at the moment we're seeking to formalise Councillor Stacey Scott as being the elected member who's predominantly sitting on that panel on behalf of the governance team. But I'll hand over to Hamish, who can speak to it with more expertise, and then we'll take any questions.
Oh, well, thank you for inviting me to this prime time slot. Sort of follows on in the theme of a difference that a few words can make. But just for some context, District Plan moving to a new phase involving hearings. And as Mr Garbett and Ms Taylor discussed at a workshop last week, there are some wider considerations around the panel's role, the evidence base, the thoroughness of issues, technical nature, lengthy, and it's quite involved. The change that we're seeking is to the previous resolution in February of this year, which held that there would have to be a minimum of 2 councillors on the panel, and we're trying to make it easier on ourselves to constitute the panel and get on with it, and options to reward councillors who want to participate in the panel accordingly. And I guess that's the gist of it, but really happy to answer any of your questions.
Thank you. The only thing that I picked up, and it was more around mitigating any risks. So obviously one says that comprised of at least 1 councillor and at least 2 commissioners, and we're looking to use Councillor Scott. I'm just conscious that this is a process that needs to move forward, and for any reason Councillor Scott was unavailable, and we hope she is available for all of it, but just to mitigate risk that we do highlight now who may or may not be available. So the workloads with different people, but likely, the probably likely ones that could offer time, just saying could, might be myself and perhaps Councillor Shannon. I know others have indicated that they're not, and based on that, because we're delegating some authority, I would recommend that 2 is delegate to the Chair of Commercial and Strategy, which would be Councillor Burt, and the Chair of Environmental Services, in consultation with the Chief Executive and Group Manager to make that decision if it were so needed, and it just mitigates any risk now moving forward. So is everyone comfortable with that approach as far as changes to the recommendations in front of us? Yeah. And then is there any further questions in regard to the report overall? Councillor Pye.
I just have a couple of questions about the makeup of the panel. We've got 3 at the moment, and so those 3 panel members are encouraging us to appoint another 1 or 2 independent commissioners with district plan or with planning background, and then an iwi commissioner team of 2, was it? So how many are you proposing we end up with? Are they going to be on every hearing, or is the iwi commissioner team of 2 one or the other, and the same with the planning ones? And what do we have in the budget, or I guess we're yet to do most of the budget?
That's a very good question. So our current thinking is that, as Mr Cooper has alluded to, we have the chair, Tony Hughes Johnson. He's already being assisted by a planning commissioner who is, we're keen to bring in another planning commissioner who would sit on most of the panels. That's the current intent. Regarding the iwi commissioners, we're not looking to have 2 on every panel. I believe we're looking to have 2 on the first hearing, and then it would go to just 1 iwi commissioner on each hearing session. So the reasons for that is sort of to, I guess, mitigate risk and also just to provide backup, because, yeah, I mean, it's quite a, well, it is a commitment even for commissioners to be involved in this process, and in their experience they feel would be better assisted with more rather than less to keep the momentum going.
I think I could probably add to that, Councillor Pye, that when we look around the country to look at other district plan review panels to see what their hearings, who they're made up of, they're typically 5 or 6 on each panel. And iwi are there typically on at every hearing. There's best practices to have 2 planning commissioners at a minimum, so that I suppose it's similar in a way to why when we have a civil defence controller leading an emergency event, we always have another one in the back room to make sure there's no gaps in thinking. And it's just to make sure that we get a really robust product at the end, and it gives comfort to the commissioners to have that spread of thinking. Yeah.
Thank you. Further questions? And just, I think, probably for public education, can you give some perspective? There might be some people out there asking, why do you need an iwi commissioner? And I would make assumption that there's a requirement through this process. Could you talk a little bit to that?
Yeah, part of the reason for the district plan review is to strengthen iwi participation in the resource management process. They're clearly there in a number of the provisions in the Act, and it's a case that they're not there. There's a couple of key chapters, but there's a lot of interrelationship between those chapters, so it makes sense to have that kind of holistic viewpoint right across the document. That's the simple answer.
Simple is fine. Any further questions? No, that's cool. We'll move to recommendations, and obviously there's 1 and 2 that I changed, which I think everyone's comfortable with in regard to the changes, delegations to the chair being Councillor Burt of Commercial and Strategy, and Councillor Pye, and Chief Executive and Group Manager. Everyone comfortable with that? I'm happy to move from the chair. Can I have a seconder? Yeah, Councillor Shannon. I'll put the motion now. All those in favour, please say aye. Against, carried. Brilliant, thank you. Now, welcome back, councillor Scott. 9.9, council earthquake-prone building update. Mr. Ellis, welcome. And that is on page 90. Thanks, Mr. Scriver.
Thank you, Your Worship. This report is in response to a request from the governance team to understand where we're sitting with council-owned buildings against the earthquake-prone building legislation. We've gone away and chipped away at this, and we've kept it deliberately from a regulatory perspective. But obviously, if we're going to look at this issue more holistically, it would probably benefit from further discussion around this table. But I will hand over to Jason, who's author and across the detail. Thanks.
Thank you, Paul. Your Worship, elected members. So if Hamish was prime time, perhaps I'm the weather. I'm not too sure where I slot into it. But yes, the purpose of this was to reiterate, Paul, to provide ultimately an update on where council-owned buildings are in terms of their EPB status. The report also goes into general detail around a bit of background, how the legislation works under the Building Act and how buildings are deemed to be earthquake-prone, and their status being a priority building or a non-priority building. Timeframes around it, as noted in the report, and also the attached to the report obviously is the amount of council-owned buildings, which you'll note those within that particular document, ones that have been assessed, undergoing assessment, and those that haven't been considered at this stage. So there's quite a large list of those buildings in there. Just to note, that information was compiled on behalf of the property team, colleague Nicole Timney, and with assistance from Andrew Dixon and the infrastructure team. So that gives you a bit of an outline on, in terms of the current status, where things are at. So I am happy to take any questions.
Councillor Scott.
Sorry, I do have a lot. I felt like I was jumping all over this report, like jumping back to the tables around priorities and dates, and then our delivery on them. So I have a few questions, and one's around our Category 1 buildings. You obviously did a workshop in 2021, which I wasn't involved in, and back then there was still 5 waiting an assessment, and we still don't have that done now, 2 years on. So sort of raised a couple of wee alarm bells to me around, they're supposed to be identified by January 2020. They have 7.5 years to be fixed, so we only have 4 years left. So just wondering where they fit in the long-term plan, money-wise. There was 5 reports on point 15 in draft. They've got 12.5 years to be remediated, but in the table they needed to be identified by January 2022. And I found this report quite difficult to ascertain whether we're in a good spot or a bad spot. And my analysis was, I'm a little bit concerned we're not in a good spot, but I'm happy to be corrected. So things around like the Temuka Library, work is needed to be completed by May 2032. Well, what is the cost of that estimated work? How long is it going to take? And is it in our long-term budgets? Because I haven't seen anything like that.
Great
so
question.
There's lots of those council buildings. What about the pools and the airports and gyms haven't been assessed, and they're Category 2 buildings? So I'm sort of thinking there's the report's awesome, but it actually made me think we weren't in a very good space. So I'm really happy to be corrected on that.
I think it's highlighted that there's a lot of work in process to go through. Did either of you want to respond? And I know Nicole has been doing some work on it, and she's highlighted that there's different iterations through consecutive long-term plans to follow in regard to work being done.
So what was asked of us? Do you want to come forward, Nicole or Trudy? Yeah. But what we were asked to take a stock take, and I think what this is a conversation starter around what that means. So I think from here, it'd be great to get some direction from council about what it is you want next, because we do need a whole of organisation, holistic approach to all our buildings and what their status is and what the impacts mean over the next 25 to 30 years. And the majority of, I mean, these category 1, 2 and 3, we've created that ourselves to try and help describe the issue that we're trying to handle. Those don't exist in the legislation. So what we really have is what does exist there is the timeframes. So when we have priority routes and we have council-owned buildings on a priority route, the timeframe for fixing those or getting them assessed is a lot less than those that are not on priority routes. My understanding is that any council-owned buildings that are on a priority route, we're compliant with the legislation at the moment, aren't we, in terms of whether they need to be assessed or not?
That is correct.
Yeah, so we're up to date, effectively, is what I'm saying. What comes next is these other deadlines approach is not a tsunami, that's a bit too dramatic, but we have a number of buildings that will need to be assessed, and then we will need to consider what their building use is. We will need to consider whether or not we keep them, sell them, demolish them, all those things. But that has to be part of a much larger strategy around our building stock. And it's probably better addressed by property in terms of that more holistic overview. I don't know if you want to comment, Nicole.
Property, go for it. Thanks, Nicole. Trudy?
Thank you, through the chair and councillors. There actually has been a substantial amount of work done in this space. Behind the scenes, I've got a dedicated staff member, and we have the project of earthquake reports across buildings. I've commissioned a lot of structural engineering works, which also then come in draft, and what I'm actually doing is looking at, yes, the priority buildings, i.e. they're on an emergency route. I'm also looking at buildings that have our emergency centre here, because there's certain regulations around the repairs that we have to do to buildings in those timeframes. And then looking at our wider stock. At the moment, I haven't been asked to do anything in regards to the Recreation and Culture Department. 1 or 2 buildings I have looked at on request a number of years ago. And I've got to the point where I have quite a lot of recommendations with an understanding now of costing each of those for repair. The question is the use of the building, how many people go in there from a fire perspective, and it will then either be categorised an IL2, an IL3 or an IL4. So there's been a substantial amount of work. It's sitting, waiting in the background, and for me to transfer some of that information into the LTP to be able to come to the table and say over the next 10 years, the next 3 LTPs, there is a strategy of repairs, but how many buildings do you want to repair, which ones? So that's actually the next part of the discussion. But we are quite a long way ahead, and I've got a substantial body of information from structural engineers now across quite a wide depth of our top vertical buildings.
Of those 9 then, Trudy, of those 9 in category 1, there are still 5 that are obviously in draft, as you say, which is awesome. But like, investigations are to complete and the assessment is still not complete. So if you're going to bring them to the long-term plan and they're in those early categories, that will have to be done, early next year? Because how else are we going to start funding that?
That work is in train, and that will form part of the activity management plan that you will see in the next few weeks, to give you some understanding and to help council form a view of prioritisation about what's important for council going forward and for its community.
I wouldn't mind just adding a little bit to that. I appreciate, Councillor Scott, the confusion. that this information provides, because we talk about and use very similar terminology, right? So when we're talking about priority, the term priority in terms of the Building Act has a completely different meaning to the term priority in terms of a workload, all right, and trying to put something at the top of the list. So I think it's really important that the understanding of what a priority building means in terms of the legislation, right? So in terms of a priority building as opposed to a non-priority building, right? A priority building is a building that meets the definition of a potentially earthquake-prone building. So that's a building that has been constructed prior to 1976. It is predominantly of unreinforced masonry structure, right? And that building sits in the areas that we have determined to be the strategic routes. Okay? So where the access and the public or the pedestrian access, vehicular access is important. So in the case of an event of an earthquake, the idea is to have those priority buildings assessed and strengthened sooner rather than later, so that those particular areas maintain the access for emergency services and people to get out of the buildings. That's the general logic around it, okay? And when Nicole and others are talking about trying to prioritise workloads, then that word priority has a completely different meaning, all right? It's also important to understand that, as Paul mentioned, the category 1, 2 and 3 on point 14 that we've tried to make a little bit clearer around, which is correct, those are not a regulatory or a legislative definition. But it was trying to convey where the current sort of assessments are at. Bear in mind that all of the buildings that meet the definition, as I mentioned before, of being a potential earthquake-prone building that are on these strategic routes and thoroughfares in our district needed to be assessed, needed to be identified, I should say, by July 2022. That's achieved 18 months before that point, okay? So in terms of the legislative requirement, done and dusted. The next tranche in terms of critical timeframes for buildings to be identified are the non-priority buildings, so the buildings that aren't on these strategic routes and thoroughfares, okay, that still meet that criteria about being unreinforced pre-1976. Okay? So what happens is that we are now working through that assessment process, understanding where those buildings are, and then contacting those particular building owners. That bit of work for us in our area, district, has to be completed by July 2027. All right? So we've got a bit of time frame as far as that's concerned. Another point that's also worth considering is that once a building has been identified as an earthquake-prone building, so an assessment's been done, the engineer has determined that it doesn't meet the threshold of 34% of the NBS, new building standard, then the clock starts ticking from that point, okay? So whilst assessments may be still being carried out, there's no clock ticking on them at the moment, okay? It's just work in progress. Many of those buildings, or the buildings that are still currently being assessed, are not actually on these priority routes and thoroughfares, okay? So they're not classed as a priority building in terms of the legislation. Appreciate that's a little bit, may sound a little bit double Dutch, and we're going around in circles and getting caught up in legislation. But, and I'm more than happy to, if it would please the elected members, we could spend another session on this and I could talk about this all jolly week. And I would bore you to tears. But rest assured, so in summary, the legislative process and what we have to do in terms of achieving these goals. They have been achieved in terms of the priority buildings, and our non-priority buildings are well on track. But the bigger consideration, obviously, for the elected members is in terms of our council-owned building stock. How big is it? What's the extent of it? And how does all this sort of tie into it? All right. So there is, as Nicole mentioned, a huge amount of work that is currently going on. Nothing to do with me, but it is certainly sitting well within Nicole's remit in terms of making that program workable.
To add to that, there's two work streams happening here. There is the regulatory side that has been spoken to today, and then there's actually my response to the buildings that sit within that regulatory framework and the requirements, priority routes, or a building with an emergency centre in it, and then the rest of the stock. If we are looking at doing any substantial works to any of the buildings in my normal maintenance regime, then it makes sense to also do the earthquake-prone works on them. So most buildings have had some form of, a lot of them were an initial assessment. Initial assessment doesn't give me the detail that I need. It has to go to the next detail. So I've been looking at the bigger buildings, the ones that our communities use most often, and I have monthly meetings with Jason, and we had a group. I've also done a framework model based on the Brands model of ascertaining a building, public use, the risk associated, etc., and starting now to push those buildings through that framework model, which gives us a very robust outcome to a decision about a building, should it be classed as under code. But what I'm trying to do is get the recommendations. What do we do to fix that building? Because not the whole building won't be under code. There'll be elements of the building. So what are the costs associated? Is it worth it? And those are the decisions then that come back to you all to say, this is your building stock. But what do you want to do? We've got a 10-year window on some, shorter on others, but longer on others. So this is about reprioritising, not using the same language as priority buildings, now about your vertical stock, in what do you want to focus on, what do you want to repair, in what may you decide, hey, we're actually going to leave this as is.
I suppose for me, you know, and the stadium is a great example where it went from not meeting code, and it went from $2 million to $3 million up to $7 million to earthquake strengthen it. And I suppose I'm just concerned, I hope we don't get ourselves in another position where all of a sudden we have $50 million worth of seismic strengthening to do in a 10-year period, because that has a major impact on decisions being made for the long-term plan. So I know this report, and I know it sort of came out a bit funny at the start, but I want to acknowledge it was really good, and it triggered me to think we've got such a responsibility as councillors to make sure we're prioritising this, and so I really appreciate the report, so thanks for that.
I think it also highlights that we've got a lot of building stock that we need to work through a process and prioritise ourselves without buildings that sit outside of council stock, such as requests by various individuals in the community. Councillor Shannon.
Yeah, just quickly, I was a bit like Stacey when I was reading through this, and like you say, a bit of a conversation starter, because it's very difficult to read. But when we do come back with more detail, a bit better clarity, please, around some of these buildings where, for example, Temuka Library, and it says the percentage that it meets the code. I'm sure that's not the whole building. Make it clear which ones it is, so that we do know then the financial implications, and probably the case with a lot of these too, I'd suggest, that we're not looking at a whole building that needs to be redone. Just some clarity around that. Also, we're only talking to commercial and council use premises here, aren't we? We're not talking about our housing stock, are we? Yeah, which to me is actually perplexing. It really is. When we look out to our communities, and I know this is difficult for our commercial building owners, because they're looking at the bulk of the houses out there, and we're saying, It's perfectly fine to be in your house all night, guys, but I don't walk into a building. So, yeah, like I say, a little bit perplexing. I know we're just going through a regulatory process, so we're doing what we have to do, but you can only then, it's easy to say, well, is it safe or is it isn't? Because if it isn't, would we not be looking at our own housing stock and saying the same thing to our houses as well? Because mine's very definitely a pre-1970 house, and nobody's come to me and said, oh, better get an engineer, Scotty.
That's a great comment, or rather a great question. However, in terms of, and here I am talking about legislation and making things quite boring once again, but it is actually really, really important to understand what our obligations are, right? Our obligations are to enforce and follow through with how a potential earthquake-prone building meets the definition. Residential houses do not, all right? So all we're looking at, although I'll just provide a bit more clarity around that in a minute. So we're talking about buildings generally other than residential, that are pre-1976 and primarily buildings that are unreinforced masonry. One caveat to that is that residential buildings can fit the criteria, providing they are 2 or more stories in height and they are 3 or more dwellings. So you've got a building that's 2 or more stories in height that contains 3 or more dwellings. Right? If that's the case, and the building is older than 1976, and it's constructed from unreinforced masonry, then that building would be assessed, and they have been, and are being assessed, because generally most of those buildings are not on those strategic routes and thoroughfares, therefore not being a priority building, so therefore they work into the second tranche of being a non-priority building. Right? So, and to be fair to some of those building owners, they have actually been, some of them have been proactive and have already done that because they know that their building meets that criteria. So they've already had the assessment done and have provided that to us, and we've gone through that process.
As you can tell, there's volumes of knowledge sitting with Mr. Ellis, so which is great, and it's really interesting. So we might engage you with council on some of this. Lots in that. The key thing is, I think, that we're working through a process. What it has highlighted to me, and I'm now, Mr. Dixon has convinced me that we do need an in-house structural engineer with a load of work ahead of us. I wasn't convinced, Andrew, but you've got me. Yeah, this is going to be a topic of conversation for some time. I think the key one for councillors is around risk and risk to ratepayers. You know, the question actually that we need to ask is, you know, how many people actually in New Zealand, this is the conversation the country needs to have, is how much do we spend on mitigating risk when actually, as an example, how many people have died in residential houses because of earthquakes in the last 100 years? I don't have the answer, but I'm probably thinking it might be very, very low. And at some point we have to ask the question, how much money do we spend on these things, because the country just can't afford it. So we are going to have to make some decisions. We're going to have to put it to the community. There's going to be some, conversations in the townships around which buildings we do and don't keep it. We're going to have to make some decisions, and it, you know, highlights the conversation that Nigel Gilkinson brought to us today, that no, we aren't going to be able to save every building that needs earthquake work done to it. So is there any further conversation to that? I think we've pretty much covered. That's good questions. I'm happy to move the recommendations 1 and 2 on 9.9. Can I have a seconder for that? Councillor Burt, thank you. I'll put the motion now. All those in favour, please say aye. Against, carried. Brilliant. So we've done 9.10, we've done 9.11. We'll go to 9.12, which is living wage accreditation. I'll just ask Jackie, that's been printed, hasn't it? Or was it the urgent item? Which was the... Julian sent some... Yeah. No, I was just going to table Julian Mays from Living Wage South Canterbury, sorry, forget what it was, did send some information and would have come and talked to this agenda item in the public forum, but wasn't available. And so he's emailed us, and I just want to table a copy, and we'll table that for the minutes. Just give you a couple of minutes to read through that before we consider the item. Alrighty, does anyone need any further time? Sorry, I'll give you another moment. Yeah, thank you, Mr. Shannon. Councillor Shannon.
I'm happy to move option 2.
Okay, we will have a brief talk about the report, but I appreciate that. We've got a mover. That was quick out of the gate. I would just note that in regard to Mr. Mays's email that he sent through, or paper that he sent through, it states that we had adoption of the living wage. We haven't actually adopted the living wage. We pay the living wage, so that is just a point of clarification. Yeah. So I might now ask Chief Executive just to talk to the report, since everyone's had a chance to read that, and we will include that with the minutes.
Yeah, thank you, Your Worship. So look, as you can tell from the paper or submission by Julian Mays, he's advocating that council become an accredited living wage employer. What officers are recommending is that we need to investigate and determine what is the actual cost of this by going through our contractors and working out. And to give you an idea of the sort of consequential effects that might arise, this is just no particular employer, but if an employer, for instance, is paying somebody $24 and another person $26 already on the living wage, if they move everybody to the living wage, then you have to assess what happens to that person on 26, because they may say, well, I have always maintained a $2 margin between this person and myself. So therefore, you have to go and do the modelling on exactly what is the cost. And we think that it's appropriate. We know his position, but what about the employers and other interested parties? What's their view? So we recommend that it go into be an item for consultation as to whether you wish us to investigate that matter and come back, because it will take some external resource. That's essentially the officer position, and happy to take questions, Your Worship.
Thank you. And sorry, for clarity, Councillor Shannon, your moving was which option?
So it was options and preferred options down in point number 17.2.
Oh, yes, there we go. So two, was it, to direct officers include it in its consultation document, was that correct?
Yep, to determine then whether we should investigate.
On whether it should investigate. Okay, brilliant, thank you. Sorry, just so I've got that. There are further questions. Councillor Parker.
Thank you, Mayor. I have a level of comfort of where we are right now with this, paying the living wage. I personally don't feel that we're in a position to be looking at being accredited. I do not think at this point in time it will add value to our current delivery of service, or we're paying the living wage. We have some long-term contracts out for many, many years that I just think, so I'm not sure how we got to this paper, but I would be, I know there's a recommendation on the floor now, but yeah, I'm not supportive of investigating or going any further at this stage.
Yeah, look, I think the key thing around this paper is it needed to be a formal process because there's advocates out there that want some change, and that's fair, and people can come to council requesting those things, but it needs to follow a process so it's been properly considered, so it can't be challenged in the future.
I have a level of comfort where we stand at the moment paying the living wage as council employees.
Okay, thank you. We'll open up for further questions, comments. We'll go Councillor Pye first, and then, yep, thank you.
I agree with Councillor Parker, actually. I think we've got better things to focus on. Since I joined council, I keep hearing how we don't have enough resources, and I just don't think this is a good use of council's resources, so I don't even support going out for consultation because it is very easy to think something is a good idea without understanding the time, cost and resources. Along with Councillor Parker, I'm happy that we actually are paying the living wage to our own team. I think the current market is doing enough to drive wages up at present, and we don't need to be in that game.
Thank you. And my question, I'll go to Councillor Scott in a minute, but my question for the Chief Executive is an option 3, status quo, not take this, any further. That's an option that would satisfy, maybe not all those out there, but would satisfy the process.
Oh, thank you, Your Worship. Look, that is an option. There's no doubt about it. I guess the reservation on that option is the level of significance. And if the level of, because is this ultimately whether you become an accredited living wage employer, is it a significant decision? Well, we're not sure yet because we don't really know unless we investigate the number of people affected and the financial effect it has. And so your risk, I suppose, is that if you adopt and just say, I'm happy with the status quo, don't investigate further, your risk is someone could challenge and say, this is potentially a significant decision, and you, in terms of our significance policy, you haven't explored that sufficiently. That's the risk, and we don't really know that unless you go and ask the community and get feedback. Now, if you were to go via the long-term plan, I don't know that it's a particularly onerous matter because you simply ask the community, do you wish us to investigate it or not, and get their feedback. Because we're not saying that we don't really know what the quantum is until we do that. And so your risk is on the level of significance.
I guess to that point, is if then we decide to do nothing, the risk is that someone challenges it and then we need to consider it. Yeah, Councillor Pye.
I just think the risk of doing that in the long-term plan is that people go, yes, this is a great idea, without understanding the time, cost and resource that it's going to take. So if we do consult on that in the long-term plan, I think it needs to be more than just, do you want us to investigate this? It has to be qualified by what that will actually mean for council and what costs that will be to council to do that investigation.
And I agree, but it's not just about our employees, it's the impact on our local contractors, and that is what worries me when I read this. We are assured that we've got our staff we're working towards a living wage or are on a living wage. It's the impact on the contractors that, again, we are getting stuck in this regulatory demanding environment saying, right, you have to be an accredited contractor. And I think that is unfair on our small businesses in the community that we work with. That would just shut people out of working with the council, and that would, I think that is a dangerous place to be, because then they go and get it, they have to increase their costs, and who's paying for that? The ratepayer.
Councillor Shannon.
I absolutely agree. But I think this is why we need to ask, should we investigate this? Because once we actually get our information, we still don't need to say, yes, we absolutely have to do this. Because I'm one of those small businesses myself, just, what it's like out there. And if somebody came and told me, you must now pay this wage, that would, one of my staff would have to leave, if not myself. But,
But Councillor Shannon, do you think that is a good spend? $40,000, surely we don't need to spend that much money to work that out. That's outrageous.
It doesn't say that we need to spend $40,000 to chuck it in the consultation
Yes,
document.
it does.
$40,000?
No, that's just...
Yeah.
Yeah, that's the investigation cost is likely between $25,000 and $30,000, which is understanding the flow and effects to councils out there. Look, I'm not a fan of this, but I do want to satisfy the process so we don't get challenged. But I do then beg the question, and whether they're correct or not, but the likes of this newly formed ratepayers group, what would they say when we're going on spending 30-odd thousand on a fact-finding mission? We are in an environment where, we've said to staff, moving into the long-term plan over the next 6 months, look really hard at the way we offer and deliver our services, and whether it's correct or not, there's a lot of pressure from the public, around the consultant narrative. Whether it's correct or not is up to people's own perspective and their knowledge on the details. But this is spending that we certainly could be saving. But I'm just conscious that we get challenged on the process. That's my only concern. Councillor Oliver.
I had the same view of obviously Councillor Pye regarding the resources that we have here to do that work. Agreed with Councillor Scott as well. I guess for me, when I looked at that paper and saw there's 6 councils, I look at all those councils and think they are in areas where probably even the living wage won't get you through the week. And we actually we don't fit that mould, obviously. And so I was a bit like the other people that have made comments here, that I'd just probably push it to the side at the moment. But I do understand being challenged on it, so but sitting on the fence, but I'm definitely not in favour of this.
Okay, well, we do have a motion on the table. You're happy to keep the motion on the table, Councillor Shannon, which is optioned, I'll go back to it, sorry, 17.2. Is there a seconder for that option? Okay, don't feel offended. Happens to the best of us. Look, I think it's pretty consistent, the thinking around the room, and I know that we've got a couple of members absent, but I'm pretty confident we could gauge their thinking on this as well. I'm just conscious that we protect council through this process, so what could be a resolution that tidies that up? Is this something you want to consider in the future, or you're just comfortable? Yeah, Councillor Pye.
Sorry, could you just explain, so we put this in the long-term plan. I'm almost supportive of that if it's very well qualified by the cost to undertake that investigation. We get feedback, it's still a council decision at the end of the day, isn't it? And so if this is just one question in the long-term plan, qualified by what it will cost, I'm hearing what you're saying about risk to council and being challenged on it. I'm not supportive of the idea at all, but if it means that we've followed the right process and can't be challenged on it,
You seconding by Rachel?
Almost.
But then I just pull us back to point 15 in the report. And so for me, all of that would need to be done and put in the long-term plan so people actually understand what they're answering. So point 15, no one will answer the question properly unless they have a full understanding of what impact that would have. And not just on our staff, on our contractors. The increased cost to the services we're providing will be significant. So I'm supportive as long as Jim over there or Doug or whatever, they actually understand that there will be an increase in rates of this much because we're doing this. So is that what we're going to do? Go away and doing that whole investigation just for the long-term plan? Because, okay,
The investigation's in the long-term plan, and once the work's done, it's going to come later for a further consideration. The problem that I have is spending 30,000 on actually that, and I know we can't preempt in a further discussion, but I know the answer now in 2 years' time, once we have that, because you can, within a nutshell, understand the costs that are going to be put onto contractors. Yeah, it will be massive. I mean, the pressures in the last, since 2016, what was it, 48% increase in the minimum wage alone, which has massive flow-on effects to council. So do we want to continue down this road or nothing? I'm actually comfortable doing nothing and let us be challenged. Mr. Chief Executive, you might not be with us for that challenge, so you might be safe. Councillor Parker, did you?
I don't feel like there's any pressure on us. There's only 6 councils throughout New Zealand, and how many councils are there collectively? 67. So I don't think there's any pressure, any rush to move this forward at this current time. Yes, we can come back and revisit it. I think if we're putting it into the long-term plan just as a tick box saying, okay, we've consulted, but we're not actually going to listen to what you say, we'll just put it in there sort of tick the box, that's not a good look either. I think we need to make the decision here and then stand by it and follow through with it if we do decide to consult.
So is your, no one seconded your motion, so that is off the table at this point. Yeah, look, yeah, I think so, if you don't
So as
mind.
I'm reading the room, Your Worship, it is that the matter of investigation of becoming a living wage accredited employer is not pursued at this time. That's the resolution, I think is.
Yeah, and I'm conscious too that this stuff can eat up staff's time, and so that needs to be the answer from staff if they're approached, because I'm just conscious that the priorities need to be elsewhere. So if that can just be reflected back to staff that might be involved in these conversations. So comfortable with that as a resolution? Yep. Mover for that? Thank you, Councillor Parker. Councillor Pye? Thank you. Good conversation, good discussion. You're all okay, ladies? Yep. I'll put the motion now. All those in favour, please say aye. Thank you. Meetings calendar, adoption of 24 meetings calendar. Oh, yes, and we've got, I think you had that distributed, just a wee change. Canterbury Mural Forum dates are now received. There was a clash with the first CE Forum on the 29th of January. You've all got that in front of you? Oh, I've only got this. Oh, my apologies, so I'll read it. So just one change. The Canterbury Mural Forum dates are now received. There was a clash with the first CE Forum on the 29th. So proposed to move the council meetings for the review of the LTP to January 30th, 31 and the 1st of February. Audit New Zealand have confirmed that they do not foresee any issue with moving the meeting by one day. So if everyone's comfortable with that change to the calendar, I'm happy to move the calendar. And can I have a seconder? Thank you, Councillor Jackson. I'll put the motion. All those in favour, please say aye. Cool. 139, so this is part of the actions register, so financials delegation review, page 139.
Excuse me, Your Worship, I do need to go to our prior engagement as previously discussed.
Yes, my apologies.
Myself, is that okay?
Yeah, no, you're free to go. Thank you, Councillor Jackson. Councillor Jackson is speaking at a community event, so Thank you, appreciate that. And I'll pass over to, and this came out as I mentioned, as an action from the last council meeting, and I'll just pass over to Trudy to open the paper. Thanks.
Kia ora, Your Worship and councillors. So this is a very brief analysis of the financial delegations related to reallocating budgets and unbudgeted expenditure. And I do need to note that this was done by officers where we've used the websites of various other councils in attachment 2. And there are some complexity, but essentially how we've come up with the tick box relates to the work in here to understand how different councils set their delegations. As you'll see from the attachment, in terms of unbudgeted expenditure, it's quite common for a chief executive to have a cap that they can go up to, and after that it needs to come to council for approval. In terms of budget reallocation, that traditionally sits more aligned with the group manager or chief executive, so group managers within their remit of their group, or for example the chief executive could say or could approve budget to be reallocated within from one group to another. If I use an example of where this may be in day-to-day, this is totally hypothetical, so bear with me. A little bit of fiction. So if there was the roading activity had seen an increase in potholes on our roads for whatever reason, and it was assessed as requiring additional operational expenditure to resolve that issue, and meanwhile the parks team had made some efficiency savings through a drone, I don't know, doing something, they could actually, that group manager of that area could say, I'm going to take the money from parks and give it to roading to cover the shortfall. We all come in under budget, which you'll see if you enjoy your delegations manual, page 17. One of the key things, 4.1.3, is the council acknowledges the chief executive's goal is to meet overall budget, and variations within budgets is permissible so long as the overall budget is met. So this could also be the case where, let's say, the information management team made a savings on licensing costs, but we had the potholes and roading to cover. The chief executive would then reallocate that, has permission to reallocate that budget. Those come through as reports to council as part of forecasting. So forecasting comes to you normally, well, hopefully only once a year, but sometimes twice, and it's later in the year and early in next year where we're understanding we may have seen some creep in costs, and inflation has been a big thing that's happened over the years, or it simply can be when that work was budgeted for, that could have been 3 or 4 years ago, and things may have adjusted because we work to the long-term plan, but of course we have the annual plan in the meantime as well. So I will sit back and let the debate continue, but if there's any other questions before that.
No, that's brilliant, thank you, appreciate that. And continuing with the hypotheticals, I'm out there in the community talking with the Ratepayers Association around the innovative drone work that we're doing within Parks and Rec, and just highlighting to this group that are focused on savings, that we've made specific savings within this group. And then unknown to me is actually those savings have gone and been used on potholes, which in itself isn't a bad thing, but I've got no knowledge. And so I'm preaching one thing with the knowing that I've looked at those budgets and I'm aware what's in them and the activity that's going to be generated out of it, but someone else's. So for me, it's around having that knowledge so I can be confident in front of the public to say what I believe is in that budget, and that's the issue that I have. Yeah. And that's what I want to, and so what I'm not trying to do is hold up and there's, you know, obviously quite a lot of different options within different councils, but what I'd like to suggest is that we do have, and it can be very simple, so a lot of this sort of stuff is, like, let's be real, it's probably likely to happen in infrastructure. This is where the majority of our budgets are, but for Councillor Parker as the chair or the deputy, and or the mayor and deputy, something like that, to be in alignment with what is happening there is not hard at all. It's a simple email to say, this is something that's going to happen for this reason. And I think the community, we would be pretty supportive of that and have confidence in our processes. And it's not meaning to slow anything it's down. It's just to give transparency to governance who ultimately are responsible for those budgets to the ratepayer. But happy to have any questions on that.
I don't want to promise something that can't be delivered, but in the monthly reports that come up, it may be something there that can be identified. No, you're looking at... No, I think, but it won't be before the end of October because the team are working on the annual report, but it may be something that they can look at and then identify where there has been budget reallocation. Now, some of it comes to you via a variety of different mechanisms when we provide more money for the carbon credit purchases, or when we bring a report after the roading, floods and so on, and we go and say we need more money. But it's about bringing that so we can also look, Your Worship, but I don't promise it as an immediate tool, but something that could be noted in monthly reporting, because finance obviously have the best visibility of that with group managers as well. So we could offer that as an option to look at to add some sort of greater visibility and move towards that.
What's everyone's thinking? Just for the live stream?
I'd be supportive of that, and then everyone's got visibility of it rather than an internal email between two people, if it's easy to do, what Mr Karen is suggesting.
Could we, post the annual report adopted, could we talk with the finance team about the options around that in terms of reporting? Probably be aware that they are very focused on that to the end of the month.
It's reliant, obviously, on the budget owner reporting in a timely fashion, and so there again, it's the timeliness of this information in reporting. You know, a monthly report is a month after the fact, effectively. So that's my concern. I've got no problem with increased reporting, but I do question why it is overly onerous to, if the decision is going to be made, you let the chair of your prospective group know.
Probably should have said an and, so the email and the monthly reporting, so the rest of council can see it, which the timeliness of the rest of council seeing it is probably...
So what we're asking is probably less so authority, but we're looking for reporting. So reporting to change your budget, and I'm not sure how we word that into the manual. Might need assistance with that, but would be the report. And it may be, may not sit within the delegations manual in this case, but it's reporting in two forms. So it's visibility to the chair. I'd like it to be the chair and mayor, and if they're unavailable, it would be the deputy and respective deputies of those, and also the monthly reporting. Trudy.
Through you, Your Worship, perhaps there's an opportunity for a trial that rather than immediately change delegations, which can involve some work, that officers work to advise the chair of the relevant committee of budget reallocation when it occurs, and that's the responsibility of each group manager, and also to provide that through the commercial and strategy meeting when we do our financial reports as a trial for perhaps the next 3 months to understand operationally how that could be completed and test your level of comfort, and then that gives you time to assess if that's worked, and then look at whether you want to firm it up in the delegations manual or you want to amend to something totally different or to remain with the status quo.
Thinking, comfortable with a trial and we put a date on a review, would be my thinking if that was the case. Yeah. Yes, Councillor Pye.
I'm happy with that. I'll just question the wording that we actually have in the delegations manual at 4.7.7, with the group managers having delegated authority to reallocate budget across and within group and their activities, yet it's the chief executive that has the authority to reallocate budgets across groups. Is the difference the S on the groups? It's just not quite that straightforward.
Through you, Your Worship, yes, it's the group. So, for example, my group, Commercial and Strategy, all the budgets that are under there, I can move or can approve the reallocation of expenditure from one business unit to another. But for the Chief Executive, only they can approve expenditure to be reallocated from my group to, for example, the GM of Environmental Services. I am a very hard-working GM that likes to support the rest of my team, Councillor.
Can I provide an example that might be useful? So you heard Trudy talk about the one Parks 2 roading, that's in it. But if, for instance, we need more money to pay for an audit fee or a software licence, and there is a saving in environmental services, that's a transfer from the environmental services group to a budget line within the commercial and strategy. That can't be approved by those group managers, that goes to the CE, and that's what the difference is.
So just move us forward. I don't know if anyone still watches Shortland Street, but we're heading towards 7 o'clock. Whatever's on at 7 o'clock, I'm not sure. So comfortable with the trial, and we'll review at the first meeting in February. Is that realistic? 3 months? Yeah. And so we just need to pick that up on the actions register, so that 3 months, 6 March. Yeah. First meeting in March. Sorry, I have to look back to the calendar, but yeah, comfortable with that. But I think that, I'm sure everyone's picked up on the messaging from this, that we are wanting to make savings or be aware of where savings can be, and that we need full knowledge of what's occurring within budgets so we can be accountable to the ratepayer. So I'm happy to move that. Ladies, did you get that? Yep, comfortable, thank you. I'm here to move that. Can I have a seconder for that? Councillor Burt, thank you. Thanks, Trudy, appreciate the work on that space. So I'll put the motion out. All those in favour, please say aye. So we've done 9.14. 9.15 is done. Go now to 9.16, which is carry forward request on page 363. And it's Trudy as well, isn't it? I'm just sorry, come on. Thank you. Who wants to lead?
Through you, Your
Thanks,
Worship.
Trudy.
So, speaking of being clear on what we're doing with our funding, this is the carry forward report, as it's traditionally called, which means there may have been a project or work that has carried over from one financial year and needs to go into the next. This doesn't impact any rates because that money has already been accounted for. And changes to projects occur for a number of reasons. They could be weather related, they could be not able to get the resources, there's still important work to do, or we've had something else come in that was unexpected or unanticipated. So like a major break in a pipe could mean that work that was going to be done has to be stopped and you have to go over and fix the broken pipe. So the list attached gives you the projects that we're wanting to carry forward. That's $8,091,124. My colleague here, Mr Dixon is more than happy to answer questions because most of it relates to the infrastructure area. We can take any questions.
Thank you. Questions for Andrew or Trudy? It is actually a relatively low amount overall, I must note, so congratulations to the team. I think that's great because I've seen larger amounts in years past. Which is, it is around delivery. Funny enough, we must be delivering something, are we? Some capital deliveries happening somewhere. You don't need to comment on that, but Councillor Oliver.
The only question I have is that because it wasn't done this year and that costs escalated into next year, does that get picked up in the following year? The rate?
Inflation
rating
adjusted.
year?
Generally, well, like we work to budget, but in most cases with these carry forwards, there's a firm commitment already in place, so we have a contract. In some cases, the work has actually been done. There's a few, like the stormwater pump station at Seaplay, for instance, is already done. So, yeah, the general rule of thumb is that, the carry forward, there had to be a firm commitment before it actually made the list.
Councillor Pye.
So what's happened to the other 11 million-ish or 13 million-ish of, like we had a budgeted spend of 75 million, we spent 54, you're carrying forward the 8. Is the balance just not happening?
A lot of funding was actually carried forward as part of the annual plan. So where we knew that projects weren't going to actually be completed, we put that money into the annual plan. So that's where.
Everyone comfortable? I think based on that we can move the carry forwards. I'm happy to move that. Seconder, Councillor Burt. Any further discussion? No, we'll put the motion now. All those in favour, please say aye. Against, carried. Okay, so we've got 9.17, which is the extra paper. So pretty simple, really. For those on live stream or watching this later, the recommendation is that Council delegates to the Chair of the Audit and Risk Committee, Bruce Robertson, Member Janice Frederick, to authorise the final version of the annual report 2022-23 prior to adoption by Council on the 31st of October 2023. So that's pretty self-explanatory. That's part of the process that we like because it's our independent members signing off effectively. So is there any questions for officers? Otherwise, someone happy to move? Councillor Burt? Councillor Pye? Councillor Burt was first in, sorry, and Councillor Pye